everyone. My name is Keith Jackson. I'm a fourth year communications student at Kaplan University. I'm sorry I couldn't be there on campus to join you for my presentation today. However, since I've been conducting a policy analysis to examine a gap in our understanding of how Indigenous research methodologies can be applied to the governance of British Columbia's intertidal zones, I thought where better to share my findings than right next to Kinder Morgan's pipeline as a big tanker is getting loaded at this very moment. This area is extremely important to me as I have lived in Deep Cove my whole life and hope to raise my family in the area one day. As a Deep Cove resident for 23 years, I have seen changes in the local intertidal zones in less than my short 2 decades of life here. The inlet is an important area to myself, my family, and my friends. Throughout my 23 years of living in Deep Cove, we've used the area for recreational activity, food sovereignty, and just for general biodiversity sustainability. Throughout my 23 years of living here though, I've noticed drastic changes in the area that are going to affect the sovereignty of our lives living in Deep Cove and within the surrounding area. An example of the changes that I've noticed in the area is the extinction of the sunstar. The sunstar is like a starfish. It has 10 to 15 legs, and when I was growing up, I would see vast populations of the sunstar down and around the Deep Cove area and out around Twin Island. Now, if you get yourself out there, you won't see any of these sunstars around, and they have become completely extinct in the Burrowed Inlet. When I expressed my feelings and concerns about Burrowed Inlet's intertidal zones to the local First Nations Tsleil-Waututh Nation, the externalities that I had considered had more than doubled in number. Along the Burrowed Inlet, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has had an intensive and stable use of the intertidal zones for cultural, spiritual, and economic resources for thousands of years. Departing from a worldview that treats water simply as a resource or a commodity, many First Nations communities, including the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, maintain a relationship with the local land and water that is necessary to their livelihood. Presently, federal laws apply to all First Nations reserve lands. However, provincial and municipal legislation are not automatically applicable on reserves. Despite this, government agencies are creating plans and policy that directly enslaves the Tsleil-Waututh Nation without any consultation from the nation themselves. To be clear, I don't find this as a pipeline issue. This is an issue, for me, that stems back to the 2008 Metro Vancouver Strategic Directions for Biodiversity Conservation in the Metro Vancouver region. This plan, created by Metro Vancouver, a government agency, illustrates colonial culture represented in government-mandated policy. Within Metro Vancouver's plan, it becomes clear that there is a lack of democratic communication occurring when it comes to planning the future of this beautiful ecosystem. Instead, local water governance policies must recognize First Nations communities of their duly created and mandated institutions that have the capacity and capability to develop, administer, and enforce their own water laws. Through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 8, Section 2B, which states that any action that has the effect of dispossessing First Nations of their lands, territories, resources is a violation of human rights. What we see in Metro Vancouver's plan for biodiversity within the Burrowed Inlet is a violation of the Tsleil-Waututh human rights by not getting their consent when creating the plan. The lack of democratic communication is actually a human rights violation through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 8, Section 2B. This article states that any action that has the aim or effect of dispossessing First Nations communities of their lands, territories, or resources is a violation of human rights. Other examples of violations in UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that are represented in Metro Vancouver's Biodiversity and Conservation Plan include Articles 5, 7, 8, 9, 18, 19, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 32. UNDRIP, Article 5, states First Nations people have the right to maintain and strengthen distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully in political participation that affects the cultural life of the state. As I stand here next to this ginormous tanker and this ginormous operation that Kinder Morgan has going on here, this kilometer long razor fence that we can see here, I can't help but to agree. Democratic communication of British Columbia's intertidal zones is a 21st century human rights crisis. Without respecting British Columbia's commitment to free, prior, and informed consent, the privatization of previously free intertidal zones is a violation of the human rights of those who live along them. Free, prior, informed consent is a principle protected by international human rights standards that state all peoples have the right to self-determination, and linked to the right of self-determination, all people have the right to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Unfortunately, this is not what we see happening along the Burrard Inlet. Although the Burrard Inlet has not been completely privatized, the area surrounding the Burrard Inlet has gone through fundamental restructuring of the political economy and nature-society relations as a result of the neoliberalizing aspects of ocean spaces. Privatization does not simply mark an institutional shift, but instead entails a more fundamental restructuring of political, economic, and nature-based structure. In turn, intertidal zones, such as this in the Burrard Inlet, have been dispossessed from First Nations communities who have historically utilized it for economic, social, and cultural development. Water researcher Rosie Sims highlights this in her environmental and sustainable research article by stating, "The cultural, spiritual, and socio-economic values of water to Indigenous people are widely deposited. Descriptions of water as a powerful medicine and a sacred resource, and as the lifeblood of the land, as a relative that must be respected for and cared for, are echoed by Indigenous communities and organizations." Ethical and moral jurisdiction over public health and safety must acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty and the impact coastal industries are having on the livelihood of First Nations communities. Metro Vancouver has failed to do this. Metro Vancouver's process in the development of policy for the Burrard Inlet region has failed to meaningfully recognize that the intertidal zones are on unceded First Nations territory. Creating policy without free prior informed consent reduces the community to a means to an end. In 2002, scholarly work from Iris Marion Young recognized that processes of debate and decision-making often marginalize individuals and groups, not only because of their lesser social and economic power, but also because of the norms of political discussion are biased against some forms of expression. What we see occurring here is communities' intrinsic features, that is, in features of oneself that they could not or did not choose, resulting in their inclusion or exclusion in democratic communication. Instead, a normative ideal of democracy involves community engagement among all individuals and public officials, where proposals are made and each are able to criticize one another or aim to persuade. While changing intertidal zones has implications on the redistribution of wealth, it is vital to create unbiased and decolonizing research receptors. As I mentioned before, an extraction of wealth without democratic communication between those affected outlines a 21st century colonial process. What is never considered in the decision-making processes of large fossil fuel companies is what will happen if there are losses that cannot be compensated through money. This is what we're seeing currently happening within First Nations communities and intertidal zones in British Columbia. If petrochemical poisoning in the Burrard Inlet further eliminates access for the Tsleil-Waututh community, how will the community be reconciled? Continued loss of natural, cultural, and spiritual resources, which is likely to lead to an increase of mental health issues, including anxiety amongst youth, is going to change the lives of future generations of people living in this area. I understand that it's not so easy to regulate and sustain an economic and cultural hotspot so that everybody is happy. But that does not mean that we shouldn't at least attempt to consider every impacted community when we make plans such as Metro Vancouver did. For resilience and increased intertidal justice, it is important for First Nations communities that are disengaged in intertidal justice discussions to become more involved through subsidiary action research. Subsidiary research is conducted by the community. The individuals closest to the problem are granted the resources and support systems to identify the problem and adequately adapt to it. Current one-way communication sharing platforms have resulted in poor youth engagement as it relates to collaborative intertidal research and governance. As a result of the current outcomes of the Burrard Inlet, I believe that it is necessary that we redefine qualitative research to help assist with increased recognition, inclusion, and social justice through intertidal governance. Debbie Horsfall and Angie Titchen suggest that through creative arts, intuition, performance, imagination, and the wisdom of the body, that we can enable more people to be fully involved in research and decision-making processes. Critical creative conversations for change in action illustrate the transformations that can occur during the process of doing research that is collaborative, inclusive, and participative. It is critical that through historical accounts of intertidal zones, we become more cognizant of the life-altering effects that vessel traffic and industry has on the area. The amazing Dr. Michael Markrick, I know, is deeply involved in a photo voice research project with the Tsleil-Waututh community. The project is introducing groundbreaking narrative about how exactly the livelihood of the Burrard Inlet and the coastal residents is being affected through changes in the Burrard Inlet. I encourage you to ask him more about that project if you want to learn any more. Despite the promise of private funding leading to upcoming projects, the lack of democratic communication regarding the governance of Burrard Inlet is an embarrassment. It is a 21st century human rights crisis happening right now, right in front of us. Well, I'm excited to see what we can do about this, but I'd like to thank you all for your time this afternoon. I encourage you, before it's too late, to get out on our local waters and experience the magnificence that it is. Thank you all. Have a great day.